This mission is more significant than it appears, and most people are focusing on the wrong aspect of it. When a nation commits billions of dollars, mobilizes its most advanced technology, and coordinates across industries to send humans beyond Earth orbit again, the assumption is that it is driven by curiosity or perhaps scientific ambition. But that interpretation is incomplete, because if we look closely at the Artemis II mission, what begins to emerge is not just a story about space exploration, but a deeper structural shift, one that is quietly redefining how economic power will be distributed in the future. What makes this important is not simply that humans are returning to the moon's vicinity. It is the timing, the scale of coordination, and the type of infrastructure being developed simultaneously. This suggests that Artemis II is not an isolated event, but part of a broader transformation. And the key question is not whether the mission succeeds technically. The real question is what systems are being built around it and who ultimately controls them. Stay with me, because once you understand the underlying pattern, you begin to see that this mission has implications far beyond space. Implications that extend into global markets, industrial competition, and long-term economic positioning. To understand the full impact of Artemis II, we first need to clearly define what it is, and just as importantly, what it represents. Artemis II is a crewed mission developed under the Artemis program, led by NASA, with the objective of sending astronauts on a trajectory that takes them around the moon and back to Earth. Unlike earlier missions that focused primarily on testing isolated systems, Artemis II integrates multiple layers of technology simultaneously. It tests human survival systems, deep space navigation, propulsion capabilities, and communication systems under real operational conditions. What makes this mission structurally different from past efforts is that it is not designed as a one-time achievement. It is part of a sequence. Artemis I demonstrated that the launch and orbital systems could function without a crew. Artemis II introduces human presence into that equation. Artemis III and subsequent missions aim to establish sustained operations, including landing astronauts on the lunar surface and eventually building a form of semi-permanent infrastructure. This progression matters because it transforms space activity from exploration-based missions into continuity-based operations. And continuity is what creates economic systems. Now, consider the participants involved. This is not a single-agency effort. While NASA coordinates the mission, it relies heavily on private companies such as SpaceX, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing for critical components ranging from spacecraft development to logistics and support systems. This introduces a new dynamic. Instead of a government executing a mission, we now see a hybrid structure where public institutions and private corporations are jointly building long-term capabilities. This suggests that the Artemis II mission is not simply a scientific initiative, it is also an economic platform. Now, let's consider what triggered this renewed focus on lunar missions. Several factors converge here. First, there is the rapid advancement of technology, particularly in areas such as reusable launch systems, artificial intelligence, and material science. These advancements reduce the cost of accessing space and increase the feasibility of long-term operations. Second, there is the growing recognition that space is becoming strategically important. Other global powers, including China, have accelerated their own lunar ambitions, investing heavily in both robotic and potential crewed missions. This introduces an element of competition, not necessarily in the traditional military sense, but in terms of technological leadership and economic positioning. Third, there is a broader shift in how governments view large-scale projects. Instead of focusing solely on immediate returns, there is increasing willingness to invest in long-term systems that may define future economic structures. The key detail here is that Artemis II exists at the intersection of all three forces: technological readiness, strategic competition, long-term economic planning. This convergence is not accidental. It suggests that the mission is part of a calculated effort to position early advantage in an emerging domain. Now, to fully appreciate the implications, we need to move beyond the surface-level understanding of what Artemis II does and begin to analyze why it is happening now in this particular way and with this specific structure. To properly understand the Artemis II mission, we need to move beyond the surface narrative of exploration. Because large-scale programs like this do not emerge randomly. They are the result of layered decision-making where technological capability, economic interest, and strategic positioning intersect. What makes this important is that when you examine these layers, Artemis II begins to look less like a mission and more like a coordinated long-term move. Historically, space missions were about exploration. The goal was to reach new places, gather data, and demonstrate capability. But Artemis II represents a shift. The key detail here is that it is not a standalone mission. It is part of a sequence designed to create sustained presence. Because exploration ends when the mission ends, infrastructure continues to generate activity, and sustained activity creates economic systems. Every major economic system has been built on infrastructure. Trade required ships and ports. Industry required railways and factories. The digital economy required data centers and networks. In each case, those who built the infrastructure gained long-term advantage. Artemis II follows the same logic. It contributes to systems like launch capability, navigation frameworks, communication networks. These systems determine access, and access determines participation. Programs like Artemis II activate multiple industries at once. To build a spacecraft, you need advanced materials, engineering systems, software, energy solutions. Each requirement activates supply chains. This means the economic impact spreads across manufacturing, technology, energy, research sectors. This suggests Artemis II is not a single industry investment. It is a catalyst for broader industrial expansion. Another major shift is the structure of the program. Earlier missions were government-controlled. Artemis operates differently. Public institutions provide funding, coordination, direction. Private companies provide innovation, speed, execution. This introduces market dynamics. Competition leads to efficiency and growth. This suggests space is becoming a commercial ecosystem. Timing is not random. Artemis II happens when technology is advanced enough. Economic systems are under pressure. Global competition is increasing. The key detail here is convergence. This mission sits at the intersection of multiple global shifts. This suggests it is not just opportunity-driven, it is necessity-driven. Competition today is not always direct. It often happens through technology, infrastructure, innovation. Space is now part of that competition. Artemis II signals capability and long-term commitment. Other nations respond by investing more, accelerating programs, forming alliances. This creates a cycle. Competition drives innovation, which drives more competition. Space technology does not stay in space. It spreads. Innovations from missions like Artemis II impact, communication systems, medical technology, materials science. The key detail here is transfer. Technology developed under extreme conditions becomes useful in everyday systems. When governments invest heavily, markets respond. Investors see long-term commitment. Capital begins to shift. This leads to more funding in tech sectors, growth in startups, increased research investment. This suggests Artemis II influences not just current activity, but future economic direction. Finally, this is about positioning, not immediate results, but future advantage. Early investment leads to technological leadership, economic influence, strategic flexibility. The key detail here is timing. Those who move early shape the system. When you bring all these layers together, Artemis II becomes something much larger, not just a mission, but a system. And once you understand that, the next question becomes even more important. What does this actually mean for the global economy? Because strategy only matters when it produces real-world effects. What makes this important is that the impact of this mission does not stay within space agencies or aerospace companies. It spreads across industries, markets, and economic systems. First, there is the immediate effect. In the short term, Artemis II acts as a form of economic stimulus. Large amounts of funding are directed into the program. This funding moves through contracts, production, and supply chains. What makes this important is that the money does not stay in one place. It flows into multiple sectors. This creates jobs, increases industrial activity, and supports technological development. One of the clearest effects is on employment. But these are not just general jobs. They are highly specialized roles in areas like engineering, software, and advanced manufacturing. This increases demand for skilled labor. And when demand increases, wages in those sectors tend to rise. This suggests that Artemis II contributes to growth in high-skill industries. There is also a broader industrial impact. To support the mission, multiple industries must operate together. This includes manufacturing, technology, energy, research. Each sector supports the others. What makes this important is that this creates a multiplier effect. The economic impact becomes larger than the initial investment. As we move beyond the short term, the effects become more structural. New markets begin to emerge. These include areas like space logistics, satellite expansion, and advanced manufacturing systems. What makes this important is that new markets attract investment, and investment leads to competition and growth. This suggests that Artemis II contributes to the creation of entirely new economic sectors. Another major development is the expansion of the private sector. Companies are not just supporting missions anymore. They are building their own capabilities, they are developing technologies, offering services, and competing for long-term opportunities. This introduces market dynamics into space activity. Competition leads to innovation, efficiency, and scalability. This suggests that space is gradually becoming a commercial environment. There is also a global dimension to consider. When one country invests heavily in a new area, others respond. They increase funding, accelerate research, and form partnerships. This creates a cycle of global competition. What makes this important is that competition increases the pace of development. It drives faster innovation and higher levels of investment. Over time, the impact becomes even more significant. We begin to see long-term structural changes. One of these is the development of new infrastructure. Space-based systems for communication, navigation, and logistics begin to expand. What makes this important is that infrastructure determines participation. Those with access benefit. Those without access are limited. Another long-term effect is the shift in economic power. Economic influence often follows technology and infrastructure. Countries and companies that lead in these areas gain advantages. They influence standards, markets, and opportunities. This suggests that Artemis II plays a role in shaping future economic hierarchies. There is also the question of resources. While immediate extraction is not the focus, the potential exists, and markets respond not only to current supply, but to future expectations. What makes this important is that perceived access to new resources can influence investment decisions today. At the same time, space systems begin to integrate with Earth-based economies. Satellite networks support communication and navigation. Data systems improve industries like agriculture and logistics. What makes this important is that space becomes part of everyday economic activity, not separate from it. At the individual level, these changes eventually reach people. New industries create new jobs. Technological advancements improve efficiency. Costs may decrease over time as systems become more advanced, but adaptation is key. Those who understand these shifts early are better positioned to benefit. When we bring all of this together, a clear conclusion emerges. Artemis II is not just creating economic activity. It is contributing to the formation of a new economic layer, one that extends beyond Earth, but remains deeply connected to existing systems. At this point, we've looked at what Artemis II is, why it is happening, and what it means economically. But none of that fully explains the deeper structure behind it, because there is a pattern here. And once you see that pattern, the entire situation becomes much clearer. Throughout history, economic power has never shifted randomly. It has always followed a sequence. First, a new frontier emerges. Second, infrastructure is built to access that frontier. Third, systems are created to control activity within it. And finally, economic value is generated and distributed. We've seen this before. During maritime expansion, nations that built ships and controlled trade routes dominated global commerce. During industrialization, those who built factories and railways controlled production. In the digital era, those who built networks and data systems shaped the flow of information. The key detail here is that in every case, early investment in infrastructure led to long-term influence. This is where Artemis II fits in. It is not just a mission to reach the moon. It is part of the early stage of building infrastructure in a new domain. What makes this important is that the focus is not on the destination. It is on the system being built around it. There is also a shift in how power is defined. In the past, power was often linked to territory. But today, power is increasingly tied to systems. Systems determine who has access, who can participate, who benefits. Artemis II contributes to the creation of such a system, not by claiming territory, but by establishing capability. Launch systems, communication networks, and operational frameworks all become part of a larger structure. Another important detail is how control operates within these systems. Control is not always direct. It does not always require ownership. Instead, it often comes through standards and access. Those who build the system influence how it is used. They shape the rules, even if they do not explicitly control every part of it. This suggests that Artemis II is part of a process where influence is embedded into the system itself. There is also a strategic approach at play. Infrastructure is being developed before full economic demand exists. At first glance, this may seem inefficient, but historically, this is how major economic shifts occur. Railways were built before industries fully depended on them. The internet existed before the digital economy expanded. In each case, infrastructure came first. What makes this important is that once infrastructure exists, activity follows. This leads to a deeper understanding. Artemis II is not about immediate economic return. It is about positioning for future systems that are still being formed. Those who position early gain advantages that are difficult to replicate later. There is also the concept of interdependence. As systems expand, they become connected. Participants rely on shared infrastructure. This creates stability, but also influence. Because when others depend on a system, the builders of that system gain leverage. This suggests that Artemis II contributes to a structure where participation naturally aligns with existing frameworks. Another layer to consider is economic psychology. Markets are influenced not only by what exists today, but by expectations about the future. When large-scale programs like Artemis II are implemented, they signal long-term commitment. This influences investor confidence, corporate decisions, government planning. Capital begins to move toward areas associated with future growth. What makes this important is that economic shifts often begin before their full effects are visible. There is also a transition taking place. Space activity is moving from exploration to architecture. This is a critical shift. Exploration is temporary. Architecture is permanent. It defines how systems operate over time. Artemis II is part of building that architecture, not just reaching space, but structuring how activity in space will function. If we bring all of these elements together, a clear pattern emerges. Artemis II is part of a broader process where a new domain is being opened, infrastructure is being developed, systems are being established, economic activity will follow. What makes this important is that this process has shaped every major transformation in global economic history. Now, here is the most important insight. The real impact of developments like Artemis II is not immediate. It is structural. It shapes the environment in which future activity takes place, and once that structure is established, it becomes very difficult to change. This suggests something critical. The most important economic shifts are not always the most visible ones. They are the ones that quietly define the systems that everything else depends on. So, when we look at Artemis II, the key takeaway is not just that humans are returning toward the moon. It is that a new layer of economic infrastructure is being built, one that will influence technology, industry, global competition for years to come. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to understand that this mission is not just about the present. It is about shaping the framework of the future. At this point, we've examined what Artemis II is, why it is happening, and what it means economically. But to fully understand it, we need to look at the deeper pattern behind it. Because this is not an isolated development, it fits into a sequence that has shaped every major shift in global economic power. Throughout history, economic transformation has followed a consistent pattern. First, a new frontier emerges. Second, infrastructure is built to access it. Third, systems are created to manage activity within it. And finally, economic value is generated and distributed. We saw this during maritime expansion when control of sea routes determined global trade. We saw it during industrialization where factories and railways defined production power. And we saw it again in the digital era where networks and data systems shaped the global economy. The key detail here is that in each case, those who built the infrastructure early gained long-term influence. This is where Artemis II fits in. It is not just about reaching the moon. It is part of the early stage of building infrastructure in a new domain. What makes this important is that the focus is not on exploration itself. It is on the system being created around it. There is also a shift in how power is defined. In the past, power was often linked to territory. But today, power is increasingly linked to systems. Systems determine access, participation, and opportunity. Artemis II contributes to this by developing capabilities such as launch systems, communication networks, and operational frameworks. These are not isolated tools. They are components of a larger structure. Another key point is how control works within these systems. Control is not always direct. It does not require full ownership. Instead, it often comes through standards and access. Those who build the system influence how it is used. They shape participation without necessarily controlling every part of it. This suggests that Artemis II is part of a process where influence is embedded into the system itself. There is also a strategic approach at play. Infrastructure is being developed before full economic demand exists. At first, this may seem inefficient, but historically this is how major economic systems are built. Railways were constructed before industries fully depended on them. The internet existed before the digital economy expanded. In both cases, infrastructure came first and economic activity followed. This suggests that Artemis II is part of an infrastructure-first strategy. This leads to a deeper understanding. The mission is not focused on immediate returns. It is focused on positioning for future systems that are still being formed. Those who position early gain advantages that are difficult to replicate later. There is also the concept of interdependence. As systems expand, they become connected. Participants rely on shared infrastructure. This creates stability, but also influence. Because when others depend on a system, the builders of that system gain leverage. This suggests that Artemis II contributes to a structure where participation naturally aligns with existing systems. Another important layer is economic psychology. Markets are influenced not only by current conditions, but by expectations of the future. When large-scale programs like Artemis II are implemented, they signal long-term commitment. This influences investor confidence, corporate decisions, and government planning. Capital begins to move toward areas associated with future growth. This means the economic impact begins even before the full system is complete. There is also a major transition taking place. Space activity is moving from exploration to architecture. Exploration is temporary. Architecture is continuous. It defines how systems operate over time. Artemis II is part of building that structure, not just reaching space, but shaping how activity in space will function. If we bring all of this together, a clear pattern emerges. A new domain is opening. Infrastructure is being developed. Systems are being established, and economic activity will follow. This is the same pattern that has shaped every major transformation in economic history. Now, here is the key insight. The most important impact of Artemis II is not immediate. It is structural. It shapes the environment in which future economic activity will take place. And once that structure is established, it becomes very difficult to change. This suggests something critical. The most significant economic shifts are not always the most visible ones. They are the ones that quietly define the systems that everything else depends on. So, when we look at Artemis II, the most important takeaway is not just that humans are returning toward the moon. It is that a new layer of economic infrastructure is being built, one that will influence technology, industry, and global competition for years to come. And once you recognize that pattern, you begin to see that this mission is not just about the present. It is about shaping the framework of the future. When you step back and consider the broader picture, Artemis II begins to take on a different meaning. It is not simply a mission focused on reaching a destination. It is part of a larger system that connects technological progress, economic development, and long-term strategic positioning. What makes this important is that its true impact lies not in the immediate outcome, but in the structures it helps to create over time. One of the clearest insights from this discussion is that major economic shifts are rarely driven by single events. They are driven by systems that develop gradually, systems that begin quietly, often before their full significance is widely recognized. Artemis II fits into this pattern. It reflects a transition from isolated achievements to sustained capability, from short-term missions to long-term continuity. Another central idea is the role of infrastructure. Infrastructure defines who can access a system and who cannot, and access determines opportunity. This has been true in every major phase of economic development, from trade routes to industrial networks to digital systems. What we are seeing now is the early stage of infrastructure being extended into a new domain, one that goes beyond Earth, but remains closely linked to the global economy. There is also a clear interaction between technology, investment, and strategy. Technological capability makes expansion possible. Investment provides the resources to build. Strategy determines how those resources are used. Together, they form a system that evolves over time, gradually shaping outcomes. What makes this important is that these changes do not happen all at once. They unfold gradually through industry growth, technological progress, and shifts in economic positioning. Because they are gradual, they can be easy to overlook, but their long-term impact is significant. At the same time, the global dimension continues to expand. As new systems develop, other nations respond. Investment increases. Competition intensifies. New partnerships emerge. This creates an environment where development accelerates and the overall system grows more complex. The most important takeaway, however, is this. Artemis II is not only about reaching space. It is about shaping the structure within which future activity will occur. And once that structure is established, it influences everything that follows. So, the key question is no longer just what this mission achieves today. It is what it sets in motion. Because the real significance lies in the systems being built and how those systems will define the future of economic activity. Understanding this changes the way we interpret developments like Artemis II. It shifts the focus from individual events to the underlying systems that quietly shape the world over time.